Um, if you can please turn your cameras on, that way I know that whether you're engaged in what's going on here or not throughout the session. I could definitely give you points for attending today as long as you're in the game between now and the end of our class period here. I want to begin with a couple of announcements. You may have seen in your email a few minutes ago that I have extended the deadline for part 3 of the infographic assignment. We were getting quite a few requests from students for some additional time, especially because you have a final exam on Sunday. Then that was coming along pretty fast after the old deadline for the infographic assignment part 3. And so I've extended that deadline from Friday to Tuesday night at 11:59 p.m. So this gives you 4 additional days to get that done. That's quite a bit of time, of additional time. And it also should open up some time for you to study a bit more for the final exam, which I understand is pretty important for some of you. So I wanted to make sure and let you know about that assignment. One more thing that I want to mention about infographic assignment part 3 is that one of the issues that's coming up for quite a few of you, definitely not all of you, so I apologize. Some of you don't need this clarification. Definitely some of you do. This assignment, really like most assignments that you're going to have as a college student where you do research, is going to ask you to focus, going to require, just as in part 1 and part 2, require you to focus on academic sources instead of non-academic sources. And it's also going to require you to focus on primary sources rather than secondary sources. So make sure that you understand the difference between those two. I have posted 2 videos that I shared during a previous Wednesday session. I posted them to Canvas just a few minutes ago under the section where at the top where it has all the documents for the infographic assignment. It's got sampled infographics and so forth. I've added links to 2 videos that really explain the difference. One of them has a woman with a pretty strong English accent that will take you about a minute to get used to. It's really annoying at first, to me at least. But then once you get into it, you're going to find a pretty solid list of ways to determine whether a source that you're thinking about using is an academic one. Video is pretty straightforward. I don't have time today to go through all of that. We've kind of gone through that before. The other video that I've posted is about primary versus secondary sources. Your sources need to not only be academic, they need to be primary sources. So for example, your textbook is an academic source. It is written by academics, and nearly everything that it uses and cites and summarizes is academic research. But it is a secondary source, and you need to use primary sources for this assignment. I don't get credit for writing textbooks. That technically falls outside of my job description when it comes to research, because it's not research. It's not presenting anything new. It's summarizing old stuff. And you know, when we summarize things, we kind of simplify them a little bit, and that's why in academic work you don't cite secondary sources. Another thing that you wouldn't cite that is a secondary source is like, oh, maybe there's an article in Business Insider or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times about some issue that connects with the topic of your infographic. And, you know, that's great. It may be a useful source of information. but it's not one that you would cite, and it's not one that you'd use as a core source for your project. They may talk about a study in that paper, an academic study. You would need to go then find that academic study. And if you found that academic study that they were talking about in that article and you used that information, there you're looking at a source that is academic and primary. So you want to use academic and primary sources. I've just given you a brief summary. It may not make tons of sense at this point. I would strongly suggest that you take a look at that video. Some of you lost points on that for part 1. You were reminded about the importance of this. You lost points for it on part 2, and you will lose even more points for it on part 3 if you don't fix that. If you cite, for example, the textbook on your infographic, you are citing a secondary source, and that is not appropriate for this assignment. Do not cite the textbook, you will lose points. Do not cite the textbook, you will lose points. Do not cite the textbook, you will lose points. Do not cite newspapers. Do not cite magazines. Do not cite anything that could be found on the coffee table at your doctor's office or through a basic Google search. Things that come up under Google Scholar typically are academic sources. But again, there's a video that goes step by step in explaining to you how to figure out those differences, and another video about primary versus secondary. So make sure you check those out. Any other questions about the infographic assignment before we move forward? Okay. Yes, Terry. Terry, I think you're muted.
I was only playing, since you repeated it 3 times. So what you're saying is, do not cite the textbook.
Do not cite the textbook. Yeah, it is a real pet peeve. Maybe some students think that's a nice thing to do because I happen to be the first author of the textbook, but it's a secondary information source, and it's just not appropriate for this assignment. And this is not like Dr. Scott being a pet peeve about something. Your papers that you turn in for the rest of your college career are 99% of the time going to have the same requirement. So you're going to need to understand this difference. It's not just for one assignment in one class. This is going to come up over and over again. And it is a real pet peeve for professors, just to be straightforward with you. So the reason is because there's a lot of really great research out there, and it's really frustrating when students cite things that are really not research or that are just third-hand descriptions of research that often are oversimplified and not technically accurate. And you're sitting here with access to a library and zillions of great pieces of research. And so we want to make sure that you focus on those. Yeah, Christina?
I get my scholarly articles from Google Scholar and PsycInfo from the Atkins database. So I just wanted to make sure that those were fine sources that I could get my resources from, or my information from.
Those are not sources, those are databases. The articles that you might get are sources.
Okay, but those databases,
those databases, I would say about 90% of what's in those databases are academic articles. But I would still check out that video that talks about how to identify an academic source, because, for example, there are trade journals like Human Resources Management Monthly, Leadership Daily. There's a lot of trade journals that are out there that talk about organizational topics, and some of those, unfortunately, are indexed in those databases. I say unfortunately because those databases are really intended to be academic. And those articles are really no different than, an article in the Wall Street Journal. They're summarizing something. It's not an actual piece of research. But as a good rule of thumb, yes, if you find something on Google Scholar, I would say there's a 90% chance it's an academic source. I wish I could give you a cleaner answer than that, but so take a look at the video that talks about how to identify an academic source. And it'll tell you how to figure that out. But for example, if it's written by an academic at a university and it came out of Google Scholar and it cites other journal articles, has like a reference section at the end, it's an academic source.
Okay, just because I'm a psych major, so I know how to find sources because I do research. I just wanted to make sure that if we actually read the article that involves a study, that's fine to use.
Yeah, if it's the study itself, it's an academic source. Absolutely. If it's a summary of a study, of like what was learned from the study, that's in some trade magazine, which sometimes appears in those databases, unfortunately, then it's not. But if you see that it's, written by an academic and it has a reference list at the end and it is about a research project, or it is synthesizing information from a set of research projects, then it's an academic source. So I would say that's a good rule of thumb. If you get it out of PsycInfo, Google Scholar, very good chance you're looking at an academic source. I'm just warning you that there are a few things in there that are not. Wish I could give you a less ambiguous answer, but unfortunately, that's just how this works. Okay, any other questions about the infographic assignment? Okay, so on to the final exam. Same format as before. This time, because it's over so much material, cutting across so many different chapters, even though it's the same number of questions, I want to give you even more time than I gave you on exam 2, which is even more time than I gave you on exam 1. So you had 70 minutes on exam 2 to answer 40 questions. I'm giving you 80 minutes to answer 40 questions. Still, on average, the typical student in this class, we can see how much time people take. Typical student is completing the exam in 40 to 45 minutes, at least on exams 1 and 2. Probably take longer for the final exam. The final exam is also worth more points than either the first exam or the second exam because it's a cumulative exam. It's over more material. So it's a more challenging exam. And so it's worth more points toward your final grade. So, if you're worried about your grade in the class, these last 2 assignments, this one and the final exam and the part 3 of the infographic assignment, they add up to a lot. So I would really, use this as an opportunity to boost your grade if you're worried about that. And, time kind of opens up a little bit once we get to reading day, which is, what is that, tomorrow, hopefully, I pray. And, final exams start. You're not having to go to as many classes. Time opens up a little bit. Really try to use as much time as you can to really, maximize how well you do on these last 2 assignments. So 40 questions, 80 minutes, same format. There may be a couple of really standard definition-driven questions. Most of them will be scenario or example-driven questions like you've seen before. There will probably be a few questions that kind of cut across chapters or compare, how something is discussed in one chapter versus another, that kind of thing, but not too many of those. Basically, the same kind of exam as you've been seeing, but just cumulative. What I want to do is just kind of go chapter by chapter. And this is not a study guide I'm sharing with you. I'm not telling you that all these things will end up on the final exam. We're still completing the write-up of the final exam. Have to change it every semester because I find that my exams are for sale online. So we have to, every time there's an exam, we have to rewrite it and change things out. But this is a list of things for each chapter that you read that are concepts and issues that students often get confused about when they appear on an exam. In other words, you might read it and be like, oh, that makes sense. but then you're trying to apply it to a specific example on an exam, and suddenly you've got A and C both look like good answers, and you really can't tell the difference between the two because it's tricky. And if you spend a little bit more time studying these things and make sure that you understand them, if they do appear on the exam, you're likely to do better. So with that said, let's go chapter by chapter. For chapter 1, there is a section that talks about simple versus complex organizations. And there's a whole list of characteristics that complex organizations have. Almost all the time, unless it's a class about small businesses or nonprofits, you know, when you take a class in organizations, you're learning about a complex organization. And so make sure you understand what those characteristics are. There's a whole list of them. Just make sure you understand it. There's examples. It's pretty straightforward stuff. Just make sure you don't overlook it. A potentially more challenging idea that appears in chapter 1 is the idea that we're trying to lay out there at the beginning, that organizations are really best understood as open systems. Systems, as you read about in chapter 4, it's a biological metaphor. It says an organization is like an organism. And so just like the plant behind me, just like the bodies that we're all walking around and sitting in right now, we're biological organisms, and we exist not in isolation, but in an environment. And so if I turn up the heat here to 95 degrees, that's going to have an effect on my plant that's different than if I turn the air conditioning down to 55 degrees. And the same thing with my body, right? If I turn it up to 95, I'm going to start to perspire. And that's my body adapting to a change in the external environment around it. Our bodies also adapt to changes in the internal bodily biological environment. My dad, when he was alive, had there's a sac around your heart, and his started to calcify and get hard. And that heart is part of his cardiovascular system. But when his heart couldn't expand as much as it normally would when his heart was beating, it changed. It had an effect, a domino effect on a series of other parts of his biological system that resulted in him retaining water. I'll never forget the first time I saw him. He was wearing these shoes that didn't look like the kind of shoes he would normally wear. I was like, what is going on with these shoes? And he's like, my legs are retaining water. We can't figure out why. And that's because of the way that one system in the internal environment of his body was trying to adapt to a change in another system internally in his body, just as organisms and organizations adapt collectively to an external change. So the reason that idea is important is that when it comes to organizations understanding what's going on in their environments, when it comes to teams and groups and divisions within organizations, understanding what's going on with other teams and other organizations, you know, none of this works unless there is this kind of understanding of what's happening in the environment and an interactive process that is used to adapt. If you've ever come to work and found that you couldn't log into your email, and you couldn't log into this system, and you couldn't log into that system, what did you do? You called IT, or you may have gotten a text on your phone that says, hey, we're the IT department. We know that X, Y, and Z is not working. Either way, that's communication that's being used to help people adapt. IT sends out a message that says, we know these systems aren't working. We're trying to get to the bottom of it. We assume that we will have them up and running again by 10 o'clock. Does that allow you to adapt what you're going to do for the day? Yeah, that's a message that you receive that allows you to adapt. When you notice something that's not working that IT hasn't noticed, what do? You call IT. And you tell them. And when they get 50 calls like that, they know that they have not just an isolated problem, but a significant one. And so the idea here is that effective organizations, successful organizations that are efficient and profitable and effective in accomplishing their goals have this ability to adapt internally and adapt to changes in the external environment. External environment being things like changes in the economy, changes in our customers' preferences, changes in what our competitors are doing, change in the cost of raw materials for a manufacturing organization that might be related to a rise or a drop in the cost of oil or something like that. So that's just kind of a basic set of ideas that are really important to the rest of the book. And I could see there being some examples on the exam about that. So just make sure you understand that kind of core idea. Moving on to chapter 2, just a couple of things that I want to mention. There's a lot of basic terminology in this chapter that I know you guys have gone over before in the breakout sessions. Lots of examples in there. But a couple of things that I want to mention that students often get confused about is, first of all, rate busting versus systematic soldiering. These are two concepts that are kind of part of the same larger phenomenon that is pretty communication oriented, which is why it's there. It's really one of the first times in the early study and practice of large complex organizations that people were like, oh, wait, the way people interact in the workplace might be important and might actually shape things like profit and efficiency and quality. So rate busting versus systematic soldiering, make sure you know the difference between those two. The second issue is there's a section on disadvantages of classical approaches. In other words, disadvantages of the machine metaphor. It seems to be an issue. It's not really sure where it's coming from, but I have heard from several students this semester who seem to have gotten the impression that the machine metaphor and classical approaches are just that the textbook is saying that they're just the bee's knees and the greatest thing and don't have any disadvantages and are the fundamental way that we should understand organizations. And that is not what the textbook is saying. There's a whole section on disadvantages of the machine metaphor, disadvantages of the classical approach. And so make sure you understand what those disadvantages are that are listed and why those are disadvantages. In other words, if that's been criticized, if people say that's wrong or problematic, well, why? Why is that? Make sure you understand that. Moving on to chapter 3. I think that chapter 3 is one of the harder chapters in the book. It is about a major shift in thinking, a couple of major shifts in thinking about organizations. And it involves a lot of assumptions, some of which are kind of philosophical. You've not read this chapter more than likely in a long time, unless you started studying for the final recently. So I would expect there to be at least 2, maybe 3 questions on that chapter. And I'll mention, I'm going to mention 3 issues to you. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on this one. Issue number 1 with chapter 3, make sure you understand where the Hawthorne studies fit into this. Remember we talked about the Hawthorne studies, the Hawthorne effect, how they led to the human relations movement. When the Hawthorne studies were designed by these early social scientists, these early organizational scholars, many of whom had already they weren't really trained to be researchers, they were trained as engineers. They said that, they wanted to do these studies, and they were really looking at organizations from a classical perspective that's described in chapter 2. But the reason it's in chapter 3 is that what came out of the Hawthorne studies initially was a whole new set of ideas, surprising findings. Penicillin was discovered by accident and other antibiotics, and that has saved millions of lives. Similarly, the human relations and human resources perspectives were kind of discovered by accident. In fact, 2 accidents. The first accident was a bunch of unanticipated findings in the first interpretation of the Hawthorne studies that happened right after they were conducted, you know, in the 1930s. And it looked like what had been learned was if we think about, you know, meeting employees' lower order needs and then their higher order needs, especially kind of like the lower half of Maslow's hierarchy, we'll have employees that are more motivated. And if they're more motivated, then they're going to work harder. And we're going to make more money. They're going to be more efficient. We're going to have higher quality work that gets done. And that was really the interpretation that led to what we call the human relations movement, which is a really important and influential set of ideas. Theory X versus theory Y, motivation hygiene theory, all that stuff that's discussed in that section of the chapter. Those are important ideas, and they're valid to some extent. But they've also come under some criticism. And the larger idea that there's a direct relationship between motivation and higher quality work, more efficiency, more profit, more, you know, all these great things. By the 1970s, people began to figure out there's something going on here that's different. We're learning things in our research that conflict with the Hawthorne studies. And so they went back and they actually looked at that original Hawthorne data from the 1930s, and they used analytic, you know, statistical techniques that weren't around in the 1930s. You know, social science was like in its infancy at that point. And by the 1970s, a lot of things had been developed, including like these statistical techniques, some of which you've learned about when you've taken statistics classes. ANOVAs, t-tests, Cronbach's alpha, things like that. And when they went back and they analyzed those data with the more sophisticated techniques, what they found was the conclusions from the 1930s about the Hawthorne studies were wrong. There's not a direct relationship. Motivating employees by meeting their higher order needs, you know, sometimes meeting those needs doesn't necessarily motivate them. And sometimes even when it does motivate them, there may be other problems. Oh, like for example, communication that get in the way, poor communication that gets in the way of converting motivation into higher quality work. It's not just about what's in our heads. And this led, frankly, this is one of the things that led, I mean, organizational communication had already kind of started to emerge as an area of science. But it led to, you know, the rapid expansion. That's the reason that classes like this exist. They did not exist in the early 1970s because what we learned was there's a whole set of things that need to go on between meeting somebody's needs and having them be more motivated and them actually working harder, working smarter, doing higher quality work, the organization being more efficient, more profitable, and so on. It's just not that simple. Also, there were criticisms. This is another thing that you need to know. There were criticisms of the human relations approach. And you need to understand what those were. Those are listed in the chapter. There are examples. But the basic, one of the most important ideas among these criticisms was this. That was theory, that was research. And then managers in practice, what they did was they just kind of used these findings to manipulate employees. Let's go talk to the employees. We don't care about what they think. They're just replaceable cogs in a machine. We're just going to talk to them and make sure that some of their needs are met. So, you know, let's address some of their complaints. Let's make their, you know, wherever we can afford to do so, as long as it doesn't take too much money out of our wallets as leaders of the organization. Let's throw them a few bones and make them a little bit more happy, because of course that means directly that they're going to work harder and greater quality, more profitability, and so forth. It was manipulative and kind of dishonest. And that's different. Here's a key difference between human relations and human resources. That kind of disingenuous, manipulative approach is different from thinking about employees, not just as, you know, idiots that we can manipulate, because managers do all the thinking and deciding and employees just carry out the work. Instead, we can think about these employees as resources, not just with using their hands, but using their minds and their brains and their ideas and their suggestions and their complaints and their observations to make the organization a better place and continuously improve the organization as a system and the divisions and subsystems of the organizations as systems. And so a human resources approach says, no, employees are resources. And if you have a resource is something you care about, you invest in it. And you don't just care about it because you don't want to lose it. You care about it because you want to use it. You want to use the ideas that come from these employees that you're investing in. And so you want them to have better ideas. And so you want to pay for them to be trained to do their jobs. I had a company that paid for most of my master's degree because they thought of us as resources that were worthy of investment. And so they paid for a good chunk of my master's degree while I was going to school and working for them. They paid, while I was working for them, they paid for every penny of it. And they did that because it was a competitive labor market and they were trying to keep me. And so, you know, that's a human resources approach that thinks about employees as resources, not just that we need to use for their ideas, but that we need to continuously develop and train and give them additional responsibilities, opportunities to really thrive and grow and change and develop. Because if they're a really good resource, we want to keep them around as long as we can, even though we know sometimes in history, we're working in really competitive labor markets. Okay. So those are some really important differences between human relations and human resources approaches, the Hawthorne studies, criticisms of the human resources approaches. Make sure you understand those things. Chapter 4. Some of you have mentioned being a bit confused about when you look at this section on systems terminology, this vocabulary, what's the difference between interdependence and permeability? We were actually talking about interdependence earlier. My example about my dad, about, you know, one part of the body has a problem, one system has a problem, it causes problems in other systems of the body. Similarly, you know, what one department does affects what another department is doing. What one individual does affects what another one is doing. You know, sometimes the most common problems in organizations is the left hand not knowing what the right is doing, person A not knowing what person B is doing, team A, department A not knowing what team B, department B is doing. And when one part changes, it has an effect on the other parts very often. Sometimes the IT department may think that making a change will affect very few people, and then they accidentally discover, whoops, this affects hundreds of people. Now we've got something complicated on our hands here. So that's interdependence. The way that change in one part of the system can affect another part of the system by changing it positively or negatively. Permeability is related to interdependence, but it's not the same thing. Because of that interdependence, we need to get information shared between the different parts of the system, don't we? As we've been discussing. IT needs to get information from IT users about what's not working. Users need to get information from IT about how to use something or what's working or what's not or whatever. Can we have that kind of communication if we have boundaries between these departments that are kind of solid and prevent information from flowing? Makes it really difficult. If you've ever talked to an IT person who talked to you like you had a degree in computer science and you don't, you know what it's like to be dealing with a boundary that's not permeable. It's almost like there's a language boundary between the two of you. You can't understand each other. You're talking in this way that's really messy because you're not you don't work in IT and you don't have an educational background in IT. And you can't understand what they're saying because they're speaking in IT talk. And which is because they're not used to talking to people outside the IT department. That creates a boundary that makes it difficult for this ongoing mutual adaptation thing to happen that helps systems survive and thrive. And so when we're communicating well, one of the reasons that we're probably doing so, communicating well in order to adapt well, is that we have permeable boundaries. Information needs to be able to needs to be able to pass from the external environment to the internal environment, and from the internal environment to the external environment. Can you get customers to buy your products if you don't share information about those products? No. My brother used to work for a company that had a really difficult, they sold products through a bunch of different retailers, including Home Depot, and they had a really hard time getting their information about their products to show up on the web page at Home Depot, where you click to look at the measurements of the thing you're buying and the specs and so forth. They couldn't get information from one place to another because they had a system with boundaries that were not sufficiently permeable. They could not get information to the right people, to get the people at Home Depot to fix their web page and to update it properly with the right information, so that customers weren't having problems buying the wrong things. And so that's why permeability is important. So permeability is just the idea that boundaries between the internal and the external environment and between subcomponents of an organization, they need to be permeable, which just means they need to have, the metaphor is like Swiss cheese. They need to have holes in them so that information can get through them. There needs to be a way for us to talk to each other. When you have a problem with IT and you fill out a help ticket, that is one way of creating a boundary that is less permeable, because you're going to be asked questions that the typical end user would understand in language that they can understand. And the IT people are going to receive information in a way that they can digest quickly and work from. That's a more permeable boundary, isn't it? So make sure you understand the difference between interdependence and permeability. Quite a few people missed that question on the second exam. And if there was another example or question about that, I'd want to make sure that you did better on that. Okay, chapter 5 is probably the hardest chapter, one of the hardest chapters in the book to understand. It's about a really major shift in thinking about organizations. And it's about really something that started to happen in the 70s and 80s, a lot of important stuff happening in the 70s and 80s, where people began to realize that there's some important stuff that goes on in organizations, much of which is related to communication, by the way, but not all of it. There's some pretty important stuff that goes on in organizations that's really not easy to quantify. And social science up to that point had really just been mainly about quantifying things. And people who studied organizations, I don't know if you ever heard of the law of the hammer. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If all you know about organizations is to focus on things that are mechanistic and easily measured and quantifiable, then that's all you see. But some people started seeing different things. They started seeing this idea that organizations have cultures, and they're not all that easy to see. The parts of them are visible. Much of what is going on in organizational culture is not written down. It's not visible. It's not easy to quantify. Some of the most quantitative social scientists who study organizations will have a cow if you start to try to quantify organizational culture, because they know it's not a thing that's really quantifiable for the most part. And so what interpretive approaches say is there are really, one of the reasons that they're hard to quantify is that they're very subjective, these things. And so there's a section at the beginning of this chapter that talks about objectivist versus subjectivist assumptions. And if you don't understand that, it's really kind of hard to understand the rest of the chapter. It's kind of abstract and philosophical, but there's lots of examples there. So make sure you understand that. That will help you understand another section in that chapter that talks about different types of interests, empirical, analytical, emancipatory, and so forth, that lead people to look at organizations through different kinds of lenses. I'll also say that that chapter covers critical approaches, and section 5.4 is particularly important because it talks about criticisms of interpretive approaches that ended up leading to what we would now call a critical approach to organizations. So I'll give you a quick example. There was a real famous study in communication where these professors followed around these cops for a couple of years, and they really developed this really sophisticated description of the culture of a small town police department. And these police officers that they were studying were doing some pretty sexist, racist, sometimes unethical or illegal things. And one of the problems with interpretivism is it just sort of describes what's going on in an organization and how people view things subjectively without judging or evaluating or really thinking about those things from a more political perspective. And so basically they would look at things like, they would describe things like really overt and obvious sexual harassment, which is damaging to people's careers. It is traumatizing. It derails people personally and professionally. It's a real serious issue, and it's illegal. And interpretivists would just look at that stuff and be like, oh, isn't that interesting? That's how their culture works. And wouldn't really see it as a problem. And so critical approaches come along to say, yes, interpretivism is there and it's a good thing. But what we need to add is kind of an additional component that says, yeah, subjectivism is important. There's a lot of subjective processes that go on in organizations that can't be quantified. But also, a lot of those subjective processes are about power and politics, gender dynamics, sexism, racism, economic inequality between the haves and the have-nots in organizations, between departments that have a lot of resources and departments that don't. You guys pay a lot of tuition, and many of you may assume that tuition follows students. Departments that have more students have bigger budgets than departments that have fewer students. That's not true. There are departments that have a third of the number of students that the communication department has, that have far bigger budgets than we do. And there are departments that have even, a couple departments that might even have more students than we do lately that have smaller budgets than we do. And there's politics at play in any organization. And, objectivist approaches didn't really do a good job of paying attention to power and politics, and neither did interpretive approaches. But that's what critical approaches are about, is let's really look at things from a critical viewpoint that says, an organization is not just like one big happy family. And it's not just like a brain that a human resources approach says that it should be, that we just, all think together and develop a consensus. That's hopefully a thing that happens. But another way, we need to use multiple lenses to think about organizations, both as scholars and as real-world practitioners. And this perspective says that organizations are like battlefields. We're different groups, genders, sexes, sexualities, departments, divisions, professional groups, battle for resources and power. If you've ever been in a hospital or had a loved one who was in a hospital, you have figured out how incredibly important nurses are. You may have also noticed that nurses don't have nearly as much power as they probably deserve in hospital systems, and they don't make nearly as much money as they deserve. And that's because of power and politics in the history of healthcare in the United States and around the world, and about the fact that it's an occupation that was essentially originally created to be populated by women who were largely out of power at that time. So this lens says, let's look at organizations and occupations from a more critical viewpoint. Doesn't mean that it's the only lens we should use, but it means that it is often a useful lens that helps us understand the role of power and politics in organizations. And really importantly for you, the way that communication creates and recreates these power differences and these political dynamics. And that's what critical approaches are about. There's also a little section in 5.4 of the textbook, section 5.4. There's a subsection in there that talks about types of control. And I don't need to go over it now. It's pretty straightforward. But again, that's a little section that's got a lot of information. And a lot of students miss questions on that. I've just always noticed that over the years. Chapter 6 is about membership negotiation, which is about the process of joining organizations and developing your role and your understanding of your job in an organization and the next job and the other job in that organization, and the process of leaving that organization for another one. It's also about learning about organizations and occupations before you ever join them. And there's two things that I want to suggest that you focus on. Again, not saying these are the only things to focus on. I'm just saying these are things that students often get confused about when they're taking exams. The first one is really fundamental and is at the beginning of the chapter, and that's the difference between socialization and assimilation. Membership negotiation, the subject of the chapter, is about both of those things, socialization and assimilation. Socialization is what happens when existing members of the organization, which we sometimes call incumbents, or sometimes we call them veterans. I prefer to call them incumbents because I think it's a little disrespectful to veterans to call every new employee a veteran when they're like real veterans who've been in like real wars. But anyway, socialization is what happens when you enter an organization and you're uncertain about your job, or you're in an organization and you notice someone else who is uncertain. The uncertainty, remember from comm theory, is about not having enough information or knowledge, right? When you start a new job, you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And so when existing members or incumbents in the organization communicate with you in ways to train you, to help you understand how your job works and how it relates to somebody else's job, why that task needs to be done that way, because if it's not, then it has this effect and this domino effect and this other domino effect. The people who say, yeah, there's a bunch of rules here, but that one doesn't matter. Everybody breaks that rule. Yeah, they tell you you can only take an hour for lunch. Half of us take 90 minutes for lunch and nobody cares as long as you get your work done. Things like that happen through formal and informal communication from, here's the key part, from existing employees, which we call incumbents, to newcomers. When we think about communication moving in the other direction, where the newcomer is communicating to reduce their uncertainty by asking questions, observing, et cetera, we'll talk more about that in a second, that's called assimilation. Anything that the newcomer does actively in their own communication to try to learn and negotiate how they're going to do their work in this new role is called assimilation. You've heard the word assimilation in other classes, and it has a kind of a negative tone to it because it means something different in other classes, which is about people kind of leaving the culture that they already learned behind. And that's not really what we mean in the field of organizational communication. So you have to kind of, don't let that meaning of the term confuse you, because that's a different term and a different class, different discipline, and so forth. Here, assimilation means the active things that you do as a newcomer to learn your role, but also to develop and negotiate your role. Sometimes we do things in organizations just because that's how they've always been done. Sometimes people keep doing a particular task in their job just because they kind of like doing it. They're really good at it. It might not actually make sense for this person in this job to be doing this task. Structurally, and this is something that consultants find all the time, people get paid a lot of money to get to the bottom of this stuff and figure it out. Structurally, it may make more sense for this task to be taken away from this person in this role and to be given to this other person in this other role. And so what that means then is that the role changes. You learn the role, and then you begin to individualize it and change it and influence the role. You go from what the textbook calls role taking to role making. And one of the ways that you do that is through information seeking strategies. So there is a section in this chapter called information seeking strategies. It talks about things like direct questions, indirect questions, third-party questioning, et cetera, et cetera. Make sure you understand that section and the examples that are there. Chapter 7 talks about meetings and decision-making. And the first part of that chapter, I think, is really easy to kind of blow off, because you get a few paragraphs into it and you're like, okay, duh, meetings are important. Duh, there are a lot of bad meetings out there. No joke. But actually, there are some specific reasons that meetings are probably more important in large, complex organizations than ever, that you haven't thought about, and they're actually a little bit counterintuitive, a little surprising. And I noticed that on the second exam, some students missed what I thought was a relatively easy question if you really knew that part of the chapter. I think because it kind of felt like you could just kind of breeze through that material because it seemed captain obvious. And there is some stuff in there that, you know, frankly is sort of obvious, but there's some other stuff in there that's less obvious and a bit counterintuitive. So make sure you understand that opening section that talks about why meetings are important and relevant and why we need to really pay close attention to how we structure them and how we participate in them. There's also a section in that chapter about bounded rationality. Make sure you understand that. That's pretty important because it leads to a whole other set of decision-making models that may not make a lot of sense if you don't understand bounded rationality. The leadership chapter, I think, is fairly straightforward. There is one thing to make sure and pay attention to, which is the difference between managing versus leading. One of the ways to understand leadership is to think about the difference between leading and managing. Make sure you understand that. Chapter 10 is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's material about that throughout the book, but that chapter focuses on it exclusively. And there's a really basic thing that you need to understand, which is what's the difference between the three of these? What does it mean to think about an organization through a diversity lens that kind of focuses on numbers? How diverse are we in terms of how many of the different types of people, whether we're talking about things like race and gender and social class, sexuality, ability status, et cetera, or whether we're talking about like, professional background, education level, and so forth. It's a numbers game. Whereas equity and inclusion is really more about what's going on after we get these employees into the organization. Equity is about the fact that sometimes because of historical disparities, for example, generation after generation after generation after generation after generation of African Americans being denied educational opportunities. And then when educational opportunities were available, because of economic conditions and discrimination and racism and so forth, not having the resources to get the kind of education that they need, it puts certain groups at an advantage and other groups at a pretty serious disadvantage. And so, equity is about, programs that sometimes we need to set up to provide particular groups, disabled employees, employees of color, women in leadership, whatever, specific kinds of support that will help to address historical inequalities and isms, sexism, racism, et cetera, ableism, that still kind of linger around in the culture and still influence how people experience organizational life. Inclusion is about, how do people feel subjectively in the culture of the organization when they're not part of a dominant group, not part of the majority? Are we creating cultures in which a variety of employees can thrive and succeed? So make sure, that's a broad overview, but that's what the whole chapter is about. Make sure you understand the difference between those things. We're almost done here. Chapter 11 is about technology. There's a big section that talks about the difference between thinking about technology and organizations from a deterministic perspective. That says the use of technology will have like uniform outcomes that are sort of, we don't have to do anything. They just happen. They're sort of beyond our control. Versus thinking about technology in a more complicated social constructionist way that says technology is about how we have socially, through communication, learned to think about and use that technology. A deterministic perspective says that the use of PowerPoint in presentations in the workplace will always make them better or always make them worse. A social constructionist perspective says, no, it's how you use presentation technology like PowerPoint and so forth. It's how you use that technology, how you've been taught to think about it, why you're using it, the way you're using it, that makes a really big difference in how we implement technology in organizations. The technology itself does not have the power to make all presentations good or bad. So it's a more complex way of thinking about technology that pays attention to the power and the agency that we have as individuals to shape how technology gets used. Also, there's a series of models about technology and communication in organizations that's presented toward the end of that chapter. I believe it's section 11.4. Make sure you understand those models. What are the differences between those models? Section 11.4. Chapter 12 is a fairly brief chapter. This is an introductory text. And chapter 4 provides you with a really brief introduction to the topics of emotion and conflict in organizations. You'll hear a lot more about those topics when you take other OrgComm classes and just other communication classes in general. One thing I want to tell you to make sure and pay attention to is there is a table 12.1 that I would want to make sure that I understood. The content of that table includes information that students often get mixed up. So make sure you're on top of that table. A question here in the chat is about when will part 2 of the infographic be graded? We're grading them right now. We don't share the grades and the feedback until we're done, because we go back over them to make sure that we're consistent with the feedback that we give and that we're taking off this, if 2 people do the same thing wrong, we take off the same amount of points, et cetera, et cetera. We're grading them today. You should see that feedback today or tomorrow. Christina, I did get your message, and you'll be getting a reply from me today about that. I know you had another question for me that's different than this one. And I did see that message, and I will get back to you about it. You should see feedback today or tomorrow on part 2, probably today. And because part 2 does not take as long to grade as part 1. If we told you to do something in part 1 and you didn't do it, there's a good chance you're going to lose points for it again on part 2. But you'll see that feedback soon. And then you'll have from today until Tuesday evening at 11:59 p.m. to complete the infographic. If you want to meet with me and ask questions, I'm happy to have a quick 5-minute phone call, 20-minute phone call, Zoom meeting, whatever. I'm not planning to be on campus that much for the rest of the week. But I will be there a little bit tomorrow. I have a couple meetings, but I'm happy to talk to you even over the weekend if necessary. Just reach out if you need something, and I'll do anything I can to help clarify it. And I know that the other TA will as well. Any other questions? I know I've blown past our time.
I had a couple other questions in the chat.
Yeah, go ahead, Christina.
If where's the Zoom meeting that's currently being recorded? Where would that be posted?
I will post it at the top of the Canvas page, or it will appear in an announcement from me, or both.
Okay. And then are the exams open for us to look at with the correct answers so that we can study for the final exam since it is cumulative?
I am happy to meet with you. The other TA would be happy to meet with you, and we can go through the exam with you. We do not leave exams open and available for viewing. That's how exams that's how they end up for sale online. And so we don't do that, but I'm happy to make an appointment with you to do that. Or if you want to tell me about a particular time when you plan to look at the exam, like if you want to say, could you make the exam available to me on Friday between 3 and 4 or something like that, I can do that. I can set that up online. We don't have to have a meeting or anything. And if you log in during that time, you should be able to see the exam, see which questions you missed and so forth, and see the correct answers. But in terms of like leaving it open for a day or hours and hours, I just can't do that. Sorry. Somebody else had a hand up, I thought. Kate, did you have a hand up? No? Okay, I'm just imagining things over here.
Terry asked if how many points the final exam was worth.
I believe it's worth 100-something points. Let me just double check real fast. I'm really bad about getting points possible mixed up between 2 different classes. On the syllabus,
It says 300.
it's worth 150 points. So I don't know, you might have been looking at an earlier draft of the syllabus, but the version of the syllabus that's online, that has been online for, I haven't changed anything on the syllabus since August, says that it is worth 150 points. So this last part of this last infographic assignment is worth 100 points. The first 2 are worth 50 each. And this last final exam is cumulative. It's worth 150 points. The first 2 exams were worth 90 points each. Good questions. Any others?
I just had a personal question for you.
Okay. So you want to wait until everybody else logs off? Okay. Any other questions that people want to ask in front of everybody else? All right, very good. Let me ask the rest of you to go ahead and log off. Please, you have in your email accounts an invitation to complete a course evaluation. Whether you're happy or unhappy, please fill it out. You're going to be asked to fill out one for me and one for your TA. When you fill out the one for your TA, it should just be about your TA and not about what I've been doing since I replaced your TA. Just so that feedback doesn't get mixed up and attributed to the wrong person. But if you could take, I'd love to be able to give you extra credit points or something for doing it, but I'm not allowed to do that. So, but please take the time to do that if you can at all. We'd really appreciate that. All right, thanks everybody. If everybody but Christina can log off, I will go ahead and stop the recording.